listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast with Elliot Rowe and Dr. Tricia Gardner.
Welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. Thanks to our sponsor, BBO Poker Tables. If you're looking for a poker table, check out their website, bbopokertables.com. So Tricia, what have you got for us this week?
Well, I have something a little different, Elliot. This week, we actually have a listener question that I was hoping we could maybe talk about for a couple minutes.
Perfect.
So the question is, Dear Dr. Gardner and Mr. Elliot Rowe, I've been working hard on transitioning from being a social poker player to a somewhat more serious poker player. I've been playing just short of 10 years and a lot online and in local, games and tournaments. This person says, normally I drink in moderation when I play. However, I've tried to play poker without drinking a few times because I've read sober play is the best play. I notice that when I am drinking, I am more confident and I rely more on gut feeling than observation. And sober, I am more present and my play tends to be slower, more thoughtful. But a major drawback is that I've noticed when I'm not drinking, after winning a large pot, I get the shakes as a result of the shifting adrenaline levels. And, he doesn't like that. So he's just wondering, are there studies that would advocate having a drink or two to take the edge off? Or is this gut feeling and confidence I get merely the result of being under the influence? So basically, should he be relying on alcohol or not?
My thoughts definitely is no, you shouldn't be relying on alcohol. These are the sorts of questions I get quite a lot from clients. Another one is smoking weed to get rid of the adrenaline response as well. Now, what these things are doing, you're taking a drug that's dulling your responses, and therefore you might not feel the anxiety. But that means it's also degrading the level of poker that you're playing as well, in the vast, vast majority of cases. Now, what I would be saying is you quite clearly have a mental game issue that you want to be working through to resolve that anxiety issue. So resolving the root cause so that you don't feel the anxiety is far better than covering up that anxiety with a drug that's also having a negative impact on the poker. So that's my advice would be, go seek some form of therapy, talk to myself, Tricia, one of the other mindset coaches, work through the anxiety issues rather than look to hide them with drugs.
And I would also caution you about playing with a gut feeling, because you really want to have a reason, an explanation, at least to yourself, for every move you're making at the poker table. And I just don't feel like you can be as clear on why you're doing what you're doing if you are under the influence. And another thing that, I often talk about with my clients is, would you rather have everyone at your table drinking or not drinking? And why or why not? And I think you take a similar line as well, right, Elliot?
Yeah. And I've yet to have someone say that they would rather have sober players against them than drunk.
Exactly.
You reach the final table, do you want everyone drunk or everyone sober? The same rule applies to you. If you're the drunk one, you're the one who's making someone else's night easier.
Although, to be fair, it doesn't sound like he's drunk.
Okay, but even merry or, a little bit on your way. If you're noticing a difference in your adrenaline response and the way that you're playing and your confidence levels, there's probably enough of a beer buzz going on that you're not really playing your most optimal poker in the long term, if you can instead resolve your anxiety issues.
Exactly. So I think that was a really interesting question.
Yeah, and if anyone does have questions, feel free to send them through to us, and we'll put the best ones on the show.
Absolutely.
So this week we've got a really good guest, and we're going to make this a two-part interview. And this is Olivier Busquet. He's a high-stakes player. He's been very, very successful in heads-up, sit-and-goes, and he's also had a lot of success in other formats as well, including live tournaments. So let's give Olivier a call. So Olivier, thanks for coming on to the show. If you could introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So my name is Olivier Busquet. I'm a professional poker player. I've been playing poker coming up on almost 10 years now, which is crazy. I started out playing online and then started playing live tournaments as well. Originally from New York. I was working in finance before I found poker, but when I found poker, it kind of took over, and I've been doing that ever since.
And that's one of the interesting things about you. I've actually worked with a number of poker players who have then gone on to work in finance. And you've sort of done the reverse. What made you take that choice?
Well, it wasn't really a conscious choice. I had never played poker growing up or even in college, so that wasn't even on the radar for me. I had a couple summer jobs, a couple internships on Wall Street, and wanted to pursue trading as a career. I was working at a hedge fund where my position was kind of middle back office supporting traders. And it was kind of generally thought at the time, and I think still, that trading and poker had quite a large skill set overlap. And so I actually learned poker at first as a way to try to develop relevant skills that I thought would help me become a better trader. And what actually happened to me is I became completely obsessed with poker and started playing poker at my job, and eventually got fired from my job for playing online poker at work, and then had nothing but poker to do, and then became a professional poker player.
That's the most original way of becoming a professional.
Yes. I was kind of, I did not choose this path as much as it was kind of chosen for me in a way.
So you're well known for your work in heads up poker. So did you start out in heads up poker, or did you start out with something else? And if so, how did you transition to that?
Yeah, I actually started out just playing six max cash games. And, this was a while ago. I was playing on party poker and then full tilt. And, this was before there was even like 3-6. So the jump was from 2-4 to 5-10. And I would play heads up sit and goes kind of every once in a while, usually just to kind of blow off steam or when I was bored. But when I had lost my job and was playing poker as my only source of income, it had actually been relatively recently that I had also moved out, because I was living, I grew up in New York City and I was living at my parents' place in Manhattan. So I went from having no expenses and an actual job to real expenses and no job, and poker all of a sudden turned from a hobby into my only income. And I went on a big downswing because I was playing way higher than I should have been, and I had massive, massive tilt problems, and I just wasn't that good. And I got very nervous because I didn't think that I would be able to survive playing poker. I went way down in stakes and tried to multi-table, and multi-tabling wasn't really something that I thought I was particularly good at or I enjoyed. And I was playing tournaments for a while, but I didn't like tournaments either because this was even before breaks were synchronized. And I just really didn't like the life of playing tournaments all day. You just have to stay at your computer the entire day. You can't really get up. And I just didn't like that at all. So eventually I found heads up sit and goes, and then kind of started to specialize in those.
And one of the sort of the urban myths that I've discussed with you before, of you finding out you weren't good at heads up sit and goes from a reg actually berating you in chat, and basically the sort of the tapping the fishbowl and creating a monster. So if you could sort of explain that story to our listeners.
Yeah, so basically I was at a tournament, and I used to like kind of get into it in chat, and I was talking to some guy, and he was like, he was basically like, you don't even have the right to say anything. You're not even a winning poker player. And I was like, what are you talking about? And in my mind, I mean, I clearly was. I had made a lot of money playing poker even at that time, or what I thought at the time was a lot of money. And he said he just wrote sharkscope.com, and I had never even heard of SharkScope at the time. And for your listeners that don't know, SharkScope is essentially a website that tracks and monitors sit and go in tournament results. At the time, it just tracked sit and go results. And the only sit and goes that I played were heads up sit and goes. And I didn't even know it existed. I went to it and I put my name in the search function, and it came out, and I was down, I don't know, $4,000 or $5,000. And this was from playing, maybe $200, $300, and $500 heads up sit and go. So, I hadn't played that many, but I was clearly not winning in those games. And I felt, like a little bit embarrassed, and just like, I just didn't like that. I was just not, that did not feel good when that happened. And I was like, okay, let me try to get this number at least to 0. So this conversation cannot be repeated. And I started taking heads up sit and goes more seriously. And my goal was literally just to get my SharkScope to 0. And I eventually was able to do that. And then I thought to myself, well, why can't I flip the script and make my SharkScope positive and start to make something of this? And that was kind of the birth of my dedication to what has become essentially my specialty, which is playing heads up sit and goes, which are, one-on-one tournaments. And there are a number of reasons why I just really like playing heads up sit and goes. First of all, they are relatively short. So there's this constant short-term goal. Whereas when you compare it to heads up cash, there's just kind of like this infinite session that just goes on. And I think, at least for me mentally, it helps to have these kind of short-term goals that I'm trying to reach. Also, the blinds are always changing, because they're tournaments. So, you have to be, able to play well or know what to do at 20, 30, 60, 80 big blinds. And I just like how that kind of just changes. Whereas in cash, obviously you can get deeper, but you're kind of always resetting at 100 big blinds. And the difference between 100 and 130 big blinds is really not that big, whereas the difference between 30 and 60 obviously is very big. And, also a lot of people, when they think of sit and goes, they think of very pre-flop intensive games. But heads up sit and goes are really the opposite. I mean, there are plenty of times where you end up just having to go all in, but heads up sit and goes in general are very post-flop intensive games. There's a lot of limping at shallow stacks, and then there's just a lot of min-raise calling and then seeing flops. And so I think that really helps players. It forces them to become much more precise about their ranges, about getting into different situations with all different types of hands, both in and out of position. And I actually think it's a very, very good kind of learning ground to develop your overall poker game, your overall poker thought process.
That's amazing. And you know what I really like about it is how this is so evident to our listeners why you should never berate what you consider to be a poor player at the table, because you totally took it and now look at where you're at. And I just think that's like amazing. And then the way you described, heads up and all the skills you can get out of it, that's amazing too. But when you got into this mindset of, I'm really going to become good, what kind of things did you do to become good?
I had that mind, I dedicated myself to trying to learn poker in general, kind of before this moment. And the way that I did that was pretty much just reading 2+2. I used to devour the kind of high stakes, no limit forum on 2+2. When I started playing heads up sit and goes specifically, I didn't really do too much to prepare or, to study in heads up sit and goes at first. What I really did was just kind of play all the time. I used to play, I would say 90 to 100 hour weeks for at least 2 to 3 years. I was just completely obsessive with it. And I think there was a time where my success was actually in spite of my kind of lack of theoretical knowledge. My success was more a product of my dedication, my motivation, and my kind of general ability to detect and exploit patterns. But in terms of formal poker theory, I didn't really start to genuinely study and understand how it worked and what it was until kind of later on in my poker career, when essentially I was forced to. I never have been kind of ahead of the curve. I've always just essentially reacted to when I was forced to react. So I was kind of able to get by on those kind of personality and temperament characteristics. But then there came a point where other people were just too good with their theory. And my kind of brute force and aggression and pattern recognition was just not good enough to beat them. They were just exploiting the theoretical mistakes I was making, and I was just losing to them. And then I was forced to try to figure out how to beat individual players. And by doing that, I learned a lot. And then I've had essentially, I think, 3 major epiphanies in my poker knowledge. And they were all from, there's 2 were from watching people play, and then 1 was from discussing something with a friend. So maybe 5 years ago at the World Series, I was watching one of my close friends play, and something just clicked. And I was just like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. I see what he's doing, and I see why. I can understand why, and I'm just doing something wrong. And then another one was a couple of years later, I was actually watching my friend Dan Coleman play. He was playing heads up cash, and he was doing something that I was like, why are you doing this? This is so weird. And he explained it to me, and I was like, oh man, I'm doing something wrong again. I was like, oh wow, I'm really doing something wrong. And then, I don't know, maybe like a year ago, one of my close friends who plays hyper heads up sit and goes, his name is Alex Timman. Not a lot of people know who he is, but he's incredibly good at poker and really, really understands poker really well. And he was showing me kind of GTO solutions to a bunch of different heads up scenarios. GTO stands for Game Theory Optimal for your listeners who aren't as familiar. And it essentially refers to finding equilibrium solutions to a bunch of different poker scenarios. And again, my reaction was, wow, I've been doing something wrong this whole time. In that case, it was more developing a mixed strategy. I used to always think, okay, when I have such and such hand in such and such situation, this is how I play it. And what I realized was that GTO solutions incorporate a mixed strategy, essentially like you can play ace king on this, on a board of, whatever, ace 5-9, and you can play it 75% of the time one way and 25% of the time another way, and that is an optimal way to play the hand. And I had never even considered that, really. So that kind of opened up a new universe in how to think. I don't know, that's kind of a long-winded way to answer your question.
And one of the things I thought was very interesting there, you said, you sort of used that brute force attack in terms of breaking into heads up, sit and goes and having that initial success. Do you think that if someone tried that in today's current games, that would be possible now?
Absolutely no chance.
Okay. Okay. So it's just moved too far ahead now.
Yeah, people are so good now. I mean, there are people playing $20 games right now who I think would have beaten $500 games 3 years ago, and maybe would have beaten $5,000 games when I was first playing 7 or 8 years ago. I mean, it's unbelievable how good people have gotten all throughout the stakes and just how much improvement there's been. And also in just a short period of time. I mean, just from 1 year ago, people have gotten much, much better. And it's just like even now, the only way that I can continue to win is to genuinely incorporate studying into what I do. And I've never studied poker before. I don't even really know exactly. I mean, I know now how, but it was completely foreign to me, which is weird. Like a lot of professional players have incorporated the studying into their game for a long time, but I just never did. And now I can't. People are just too good. You just can't get away with it anymore.
Now, what about in the live arena? Have you seen the same sort of evolution?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, yes, people are much better than they were 5 or, even 10 years ago. But, because the way live tournaments work is, you have this kind of combination of traveling pros with the kind of local contingent that frequent the casino and get in via satellite. That combined with the fact that in the US, at least, there hasn't been online poker for a while, people are still much, much further behind, generally speaking, in live tournaments. Now, when you go to Monte Carlo and you play the 100K, there's going to be a lot of good players starting to play considerably more similar to one another. And I think as people get better, styles will tend to converge. Whereas I think a few years ago, people used to talk about how there were many different ways to play, many different styles that could be profitable. I think the reason that was true, and that's still true in certain contexts in poker, just not as true at the high stakes. I think the reason that was true is because people were making mistakes, so there were different ways to exploit those mistakes. But as people make fewer and fewer mistakes and try to play more theoretically, I think overall players' styles will tend to converge.
That's kind of an interesting point. And I do wonder if you have everybody playing the same style, then if someone comes in with a dramatically altered style, would that then become a benefit for them?
Not if the style that people have converged to is one that is based on playing theoretically optimal. The whole point of playing theoretically optimal is that if you had the option or the choice to change your style, you wouldn't because you'd be giving up money. So for me, this is part of the problem when people talk about the evolution of poker. The problem is that there's a ceiling. It's not this ever-expanding universe, which is what a lot of people would like it to be. Whereas, where it's just kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth. Whereas all of a sudden people are playing, just to be very crude, people are playing very, very aggressive. So the way to counter it is to play much tighter and, more passive. And then, people tend to play one way, and then now you can counter by playing another way. That's actually not, at least in my view, the way poker evolves, will continue to evolve. There will be this kind of tunneling effect where especially the better players start to all play the same because they're playing the correct style. Now, in the context of live tournaments and in the context of lesser experienced players, that's not true because players are making mistakes and playing theoretically unexploitable is actually not a good strategy. I mean, it's a winning strategy, but it's not nearly the best strategy against people who are making a lot of big mistakes. But at the higher stakes online and at the high stakes tournaments, I do think there's an unavoidable tendency for players to play similarly.
So do you sort of think that eventually those, $200,000 buy-in super high rollers, etc., will become who gets lucky that particular week because everyone's playing pretty close to GTO?
Well, no, because the reason those tournaments exist is because there's like 10, 15% of the field that are not professional players. And as long as those players continue to play, those tournaments will continue to be profitable. So what a lot of players have done, what a lot of players do to counter the fact that the situation is, even despite those non-professional players, is still somewhat like among the professional players, who's going to get lucky this week. What you're describing in terms of that dynamic still does exist. It's just that players, when they do get lucky, they're making a little bit more on average than their buy-in because there's some added dead money. But that dynamic still exists. And what players do to counter that dynamic is buy pieces of each other and swap so that they can spread their ability to make money out among a bunch of good players, especially because a big way that people improve is by discussing situations with their friends. So you end up having these kind of cliques of friends in the high stakes community. So you have like 4 or 5 guys who are kind of came up together, who are all close friends. They all swap action with each other. And, they kind of live and die with each other's successes.
And is that something where you feel, a lot of the time we're talking about the small edges available for the poker players. So the being in physically good shape, the utilizing meditation, being aware of basically not tilting at the table and being as focused as possible. Is that now becoming even more important as the games get harder in the high stakes?
Yes. I think anytime skill, the margins of skill become smaller, whatever the additional margins are become, that much more important or that much more magnified. So if you have 2 guys who both study a bunch, are both thoughtful and smart and, analytical players, and one of them likes to go out and drink and doesn't pay as much attention to his sleep and to his routine and is able to be like, only on top of his game 70, 80% of the time. And then another guy takes his poker life more seriously, is just more regimented and disciplined about his diet and his routine and his exercise and his mental strength. And he can play at his best 85, 90% of the time. That's going to be a big difference between how much money they can make, for sure. I focus on those things, and we can talk about them at length if you like, but I don't just do it just for my poker edge. I do it because I'm just happier when I do it. And I feel better, and I'm just like, I like myself more. So the fact that it makes me better at poker is like, it's great. It's important for my rationalization, but I think I'm a very big proponent of the concept that we as humans are like, a lot of our rationality is essentially a way to justify our emotional responses. So, I know about myself that this is an emotional issue for me. And the fact that there's like this rational strategic advantage is like a great way for me to convince myself that it's also important.
Now, you did mention earlier that one of your major problems had to do around tilt.
Yes.
What did you do to sort of solve that problem, or at least minimize it?
And what did it look like? Because you're laughing when you say that.
Well, yeah. Okay. So I would say, yeah, definitely not solved. And what it looked like, it was a mess. Part of the reason I laugh is just because this was like in the beginning of my playing poker, when I was playing mostly online, this was like something that was actually known about me, was that I was prone to tilt and I would like kind of lose my control in the chat box. And I had to like literally, I self-banned my ability to chat online. I've done that for like years now, 5 or 6 years. I can't chat. I just can't chat. Even if when I try to type, it just says you can't chat. So that was one small, like, kind of external control that I imposed on myself. I think it's actually very important, just in general, for people to understand themselves, their own limitations. And this has to do with ego. This has to do with a lot of things. But sometimes a small external control can go a long way towards helping you fix something about yourself or address something about yourself. Sometimes people think to themselves, oh, like this is all within my control. I just need to will my way into something. Whereas you don't have to make it that difficult. If there's a way that you can use some sort of external mechanism to help you, to force you into a certain situation, that shows some maturity, it shows self-awareness, and it shows just like smart strategic thinking. So that was one small thing that I did. I legitimately saw a therapist because I felt like my tilt was related to things that were deeper within me: anger, anxiety, and loneliness. Loneliness in particular. I mean, playing 90 or 100-hour weeks on the internet, playing poker on the internet, I was living alone. It doesn't leave a lot of time to socialize and to do other things. And I think that's an experience that a lot of people who play poker online go through, just spending a lot of time by yourself. And for me, and for my personality, it was just tough. I didn't thrive in that situation. And I think I was dealing with some pretty significant addiction issues when it came to poker. I would never stop. Part of what helped me find some balance was falling in love and meeting the woman that is now my ex-wife. But I don't say that with any malice or anything. When I met her, she had 2 teenagers, and I kind of fell into this slightly unorthodox role of a stepfather to 2 kids that were, less than 12 years younger than me. But the idea of having to be responsible for and having to put someone else's well-being and happiness in front of yours was something that just kind of forced me. It was, again, something external that forced me to just kind of like get my shit together, not dwell on either success or failure within poker, not let my poker results dictate my emotional state or just, how I was doing or what I felt or what was going on inside, just for their own sake. And then my wife at the time just helped me just kind of develop more and understand, gain perspective. And, I don't think it's that much of a shock that, when you start to share your life with someone, the thing that took up a lot of your life becomes less important and less dramatic. But yeah, so all of those things mattered. And then there was also just this general process of numbing, of just kind of building tolerance and general just like numbing to loss and to failure. I came from people come from different backgrounds. I came from what I would consider a competitive background. That's how I would kind of describe my own background. I was extremely competitive in different ways. I used to play sports. I used to play chess. But I just, generally speaking, just loved games and always loved to compete. But poker is somewhat unique in the competitive environment in the sense that, and this has been said over and over again, but that, you cannot control the outcome. So someone like Roger Federer, as he goes through and I'm not the Roger Federer of poker, I'm not trying to make that analogy, but someone like Roger Federer, as he goes through his tennis career as a junior, as a teenager, he probably didn't deal with failure that often. He didn't really deal with losing that often and didn't really have to. And people, when you play poker, you just can play better than everyone. You can play perfectly, whatever, and just still lose and over again. And everybody who plays poker understands that and knows that. But I think emotionally, it was, for me, a new experience to just be forced to disassociate your results from your actions and your decisions. And that took time. And I think especially for me, like some of the high stakes players that I know, that I've interacted with and become friends with, there's a spectrum in terms of how emotional, how analytical, just the different temperaments and personalities that people have. And I was a fiery person. I am an emotional person. So I think it was a little bit, the analytical part for me was the strategic part for me came relatively naturally. I think I was talented in that way and lucky. But the emotional part for me, the emotional control part for me was like one of my big challenges and weaknesses. And I was just forced to confront that in order to become consistently successful.
And is that something, again, where in today's games, do you think you would have even had the opportunity to confront that?
I would have had no chance. No, I'm being completely honest with you.
Yeah.
I think even 5 years later, much less today's game, if I was in the exact same situation that I had been in, what I would have done is I would have tried and I just would have lost, and I would have lost probably much quicker, much more decisively. You know, I ran good in the beginning of my online poker career. So even if I ran good and ran up to 30 or 40,000 instead of like 80 or 100,000 because other people were so good, I just would have lost that, and it would have just been like, just clear to me that this was not something that I could pursue. I think I would have just given up. That's honestly what I think would have happened.
You know, it's so interesting to hear you say that, because there are a minority of people today, I think, who believe that the mental game is just not all that important. And it sounds like you're saying it's gotten more important.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were mentally strong 7 years ago, it was important then. It just wasn't as necessary. I think now it's just a requirement. It's an absolute necessity because everyone is so good and the margins are so small that if you're not, you just can't make it.
And with that in place, I mean, the way you were describing the Heads Up Sit and Goes now as incredibly competitive, but a brilliant learning ground for poker as a game in its entirety, would you still recommend to players give them a try, but be aware that this is a dog-eat-dog environment and you might not become a millionaire, but you will be a much better poker player? How do you see it from that side?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see it differently than I used to see it. I mean, yes, Heads Up Sit and Goes are tough, but I mean, cash is tougher. At the time, Heads Up Sit and Goes were not that tough, but cash was still a little bit tougher then too. So I think there's always been this, you know, if you're comparing, you know, I don't know anything about 6 or 9 max sit and goes. I don't really know them, so I can't really speak intelligently on them. And I don't even know cash that well, but I just know enough to know that the environment, the competitive environment of cash games online is tougher than Heads Up Sit and Goes, and just insanely tough overall. So, I mean, if somebody wants to try to develop their game and learn, I think Heads Up Sit and Goes are a great like place and way to do it, especially compared to tournaments, and also, you know, to help you play tournaments. I think Heads Up Sit and Goes are a better way to learn to be good at tournaments than cash games are, because in tournaments, you're so often dealing with different blind levels, and very often blind levels that are, let's say, 80 or below. And that's exactly what Heads Up Sit and Goes are. And, you know, there's been a number of Heads Up Sit and Go players who have had a ton of success. Dan Coleman is obviously a good example. Martin Finger's another example, but there's a lot of them. And I think if Heads Up Sit and Go guys, if more of them decided to play live tournaments, I think that, like, my friend Alex, for example, I think could be one of the best live tournament players if he wanted to be. He just doesn't have that interest. He just doesn't want to travel. He doesn't want to play live, so he doesn't do it. But yeah, I think Heads Up Sit and Goes are definitely a great place to develop your game and learn, for sure.
So we'll be playing part 2 of that interview next week. So Trisha, where can people find out about you and your products?
You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Trisha Cardner, or you can go to my website, drtrishacardner.com.
And if people are interested in my coaching and my products, head to pokermindcoach.com. We'll see you next week for the second part of that interview.
You've been listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast with Elliot Rowe and Dr. Trisha Cardner. To get any resources mentioned in the episode or to listen to past shows, visit pokermindcoach.com/TMA podcast. Thanks for listening.